Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today is my great friend and fellow Western New Yorker, Kevin Pawlak. Go Bills, Kevin.
Go Bills, Chris.
All right. How are you doing today?
Good. How about yourself?
I'm doing well, very well, thank
Good.
you. Now, I think many of our ECW loyal, faithful readers know you as an Antietam guy. You're a licensed battlefield guide at Antietam. And by day, you manage the Bristow Station battlefield. So you've got that. But I don't think people realize you also have a degree of expertise in First Manassas because you do a lot of work there in the county and do a lot of battlefield tours and a lot of the history connected there because of the various other sites that you're associated with.
Yeah, that's correct. And Rob Orson and I have been working on a book for the Emerging Civil War series about that. And so I haven't received my graduate certificate just yet. I guess that won't happen until that comes out. So still in the process of working on it. But as you know, these things never end
Sure, sure.
in terms of always learning more about it.
Well, one of the sites you manage is Ben Lomond, which has a direct tie to the first Battle of Manassas. So just tell us a little bit about that site because it's a wicked cool site and it'll kind of serve to get us into our topic here today.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's Ben Lomond is an 1832 house that was built by Benjamin Chin, who would probably be familiar, at least the last name is familiar to most people. Chin Ridge is named for that same man. He did not live at Ben Lomond at the time of the Civil War, but still owned it. He actually lived on Chin Ridge, hence the name. But Ben Lomond sat along a series of farm roads that was collectively known as Rocky Lane or Rock Road in 1861. And thousands of Confederate soldiers, including who we'll talk about tonight, passed by Ben Lomond on their way up to places like we know Portici, Henry Hill, Chin Ridge, even Matthews Hill as well. And in the process of that, Ben Lomond became a hospital that became known as the Pringle House Hospital. And that's the main story that we talk about on the site today. So when visitors come to see it, they'll get an experience of what a Civil War hospital not only was like, but what it sounded like. We have sounds that are pumped through the house. We have smells as well. Everything in the house is pretty much something that you can actually touch. So you're not going to find the nice red velvet ropes and carpets that you have to stay on, or you'll get yelled at if you veer from that course. So it's meant to be a very interactive exhibit and really give folks, of course, it's a watered down version because we want kids to come as well, but give folks really an idea and engage them in many different senses about what the aftermath of First Manassas and the first major battle of the Civil War was like.
Yeah, and I love it as a site because it's so immersive and it's so interactive and it's unique among so many different Civil War sites. So.
Yeah, that's the idea behind it, and we always get a lot of comments about that, both good and bad, because the smells that we have in the house are, as you can imagine, we have a good smell and we have some bad smells as well, which probably would have been the overpowering smells in 1861.
Yeah. Oh, wow. And I will leave it to viewers and listeners to go and explore themselves, so they can then make a little checklist of all of the good and bad smells that they come up with.
That's right, and if they want to purchase any of the bad smells for themselves, I have a few contacts that I can set them up with.
There, see, perfect. What a guy. What a guy.
I do what I can.
Yeah. So I asked Kevin to join us today because I'm really interested in kind of we're talking about rivalries and partnerships as we gear up for the emerging Civil War Symposium in August. And the rivalry slash partnership between the two Confederate commanders at First Manassas is really interesting to me because you've got two very colorful characters, P.G.T. Beauregard and Joe Johnston. It's the first battle of the war, so first major battle of the war. So, folks are trying to figure out how to use the armies, how the command structure works, how to get personalities to mesh. And I just want to ask somebody about that because that seems like a maelstrom of potential confusion and craziness.
Yes, it absolutely is. I mean, you could almost characterize First Manassas and the armies led by both Joseph E. Johnston and P.G.T. Beauregard and Irvin McDowell as more armed mobs than armies at that point. Some of the brigade commanders and division commanders, well, they didn't have division commanders in the Confederate Army, but division commanders in McDowell's army did have some prior military experience, and certainly some of the common soldiers did as well that were there, at least with some pre-war militia experience. But the two armies that will engage along the banks of Bull Run on July 21st, 1861, are the two largest armies ever fielded in North America at the time. And like you said, these are soldiers that in many cases, or at least generals that had in many cases only commanded maybe at most a couple of hundred men
Uh,
uh, in the field prior to this. So talk about learning on the job
yeah,
with
right,
deadly
right.
consequences to it if you perform well or not. It's pretty amazing that a battle was came to be at First Manassas in the first place of moving and maneuvering armies onto the field to engage one another.
Now, Irvin McDowell famously said that, "Oh gosh, we're green. We're not ready for this." And Lincoln responds that you're green, they're green, we're all green alike. So just go do something. But like McDowell realizes that this is going to be a problem because his men really quite aren't ready for this. The army as an institution isn't ready for this. Do the Confederates realize that?
Yeah, I certainly think that they do. I think the Confederates did have a few advantages at the start of the war, one most notably being what we would refer to today as home field advantage. Of course, being more familiar with the terrain, with the road networks in the area. The Confederate Army, at least under Beauregard, had been in the Manassas Junction area since early June of 1861, so they had nearly 50 days to prepare defenses, to scout out positions, different things like that. But yes, overwhelmingly, the soldiers were green as well. And that's something that maybe did not become quite as apparent to the Confederates before First Manassas, but I'm sure we'll get to this later on. But in the immediate aftermath of First Manassas, both Johnston and Beauregard realized just how the green nature of their army could impact future operations in Northern Virginia, at least in 1861, until the units became more cohesive. They drilled more formally and really turned into soldiers from just volunteers.
Uh, Put me inside of Joe Johnson's head and P.G.T. Beauregard's head for just a second, which may be a scary thing. I apologize if that is right. Do either of them see themselves as green, or do they see themselves and or each other as being up to the task that's about to be at hand?
I think certainly both of them probably do. Of course, Johnson had spent nearly 3 decades, or actually over 3 decades, in the United States Army by 1861. Both of them had fought in Mexico. Actually, together they had fought in Mexico, so their relationship goes back all the way to the mid 1840s. Um, but I think both of them were pretty confident in themselves, and based off of, I think maybe Johnston had a bit more of an understanding of the limitations of his own army than Beauregard did. Beauregard was often prone to very grandiose plans that I think were, he's biting off more than he could chew, in a lot of ways, but especially with the army that he had at hand in the summer of 1861. And I think part of that was just Beauregard's personality. He was always trying to pull off those types of plans throughout the war, not just in 1861. But I think that he really failed to recognize how difficult it would be to pull those plans off, especially and this would happen to him on July 21st, 1861, especially with the fact of these guys are still building their armies while they're fighting with them, which is an incredibly difficult task. And it shows in a lot of ways in the Confederate performance and, of course, the Federal performance as well on July 21st.
And we'll talk a little bit more about Beauregard's grandiose plans and personality. He does have reason to be riding high in the hog, I suppose, at this point. He's the Confederacy's first war hero after Fort Sumter. How does that play into his psyche here in these months leading up to the Battle of First Manassas?
Yeah, it certainly absolutely does, and I think it feeds into the psyche of the soldiers that are under his command as well. That they have the hero of Fort Sumter, uh, taking charge of them. It's interesting too because of course Beauregard is ultimately going to receive what's really the prime job for Confederate field commanders in July or in June of 1861, that summer, which is taking command of the main Confederate field army that's operating closest to Washington, D.C. And so I think his ego, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I think just stating it as a matter of fact, continues to grow from there. That he's the hero of Fort Sumter, and then he's given the main job of any Confederate field commander by taking, positions less than 25 miles from Washington, D.C., and the Lincoln administration. And of course, when Johnston will take command of the Army of the Shenandoah, that's kind of the backwater job, if you will, in Virginia at the time. And it's interesting to see. I think in a lot of ways that could have fractured the relationship of, Johnson, who was always somebody that was aware of his rank, who was subordinate to him, who was superior to him. That could have really thrown their relationship off the rails potentially. That, Johnston saying, "Well, why does Beauregard have this position over me?" That Johnston outranks Beauregard, but why does Beauregard get sort of again the main role, the main generalship in Virginia at the time?
And I suppose it's worth noting that once Virginia secedes, that turns Harper's Ferry into an incredibly important strategic point because geographically, and there's the arsenal there. So it's natural that Johnston got sent there because at that moment that becomes like, ooh, the big key spot. But then that sort of consigns him to the Valley districts as the rest of the war begins to evolve and the Valley becomes less important. But he's kind of stuck there, right?
Yeah, yeah, he is. I think of it as I'm not a big I certainly wouldn't consider myself an expert in the Western theater of the Civil War, but I recognize the importance of the Western theater in determining the outcome of the Civil War. But there's no shying away from it that the Eastern theater is where the media was, where the attention was of both nations. And you can see that between July of 1861. A lot of the media attention will turn to Manassas and Beauregard and Johnston, despite you're absolutely right, Harper's Ferry being an incredibly important position, an important place for both armies to be able to hold during the course of the Civil War is sort of kind of it's viewed as the smaller of the two armies. Beauregard will have about 22,000. Johnston will only have about 12,000, and it's of course further away from Washington, D.C. than what Beauregard is. And in reality, the federal planning indicated that or showed the importance of the battlefield being closer to Washington, D.C., because that's where the major federal army that was operating. Of course, there's one in the Valley, the Army of Pennsylvania under Robert Patterson, but the main army under Irvin McDowell is going to be operating out of Washington, D.C. and against Beauregard. So in a lot of ways, you're absolutely right about Harper's Ferry's importance, but I think in Johnston's mind and in the mind of both nations at the time, it was viewed as kind of the second tier AAA baseball compared to the MLB, I guess you could say.
Yeah. And I suppose, we do have to remember, like, it is where the guns are and the gun manufacturing capabilities are, even though it's basically an indefensible geographic position, as both sides find out over the course of the war.
Yep. Yeah,
But it,
Jackson knew it when he was there before Johnston. Johnston knew it. That's why he wanted to pull out of Harper's Ferry and ultimately did. And of course, multiple times during the course of the war, other commanders would find how indefensible Harper's Ferry proved to be. One soldier commented that it was sort of like defending the bottom of a bowl.
yeah.
If you were defending Harper's Ferry, that if you didn't have, the ridge of the bowl on top, then there was no point. You were just sitting ducks down there.
So you mentioned earlier about Johnson being sensitive to issues of rank, and so I suppose that's maybe a good time for us to talk about that because here you've got Beauregard with the largest army and the plum assignment, Johnson with a smaller army in a theater that is becoming less important at this time in the war, but he has a higher rank. Tell us a little bit about the infamous Jeff Davis decision to rank his top five generals and how Johnson and Beauregard fall on that list.
Yeah, so first on the list is Samuel Cooper, who of course will become basically he's a general that never takes the field for the Confederacy during the course of the war. You have Robert E. Lee, Elbert Sidney Johnston on that list, and then Joseph Johnston as well. And Beauregard will ultimately come in fifth. And when he receives his rank as a full general in the Confederacy, it's actually on the recommendation of Joseph E. Johnston on July 22nd, 1861, to Beauregard. But of course, Johnston viewed and I'm no military rank expert at all, but Johnston did hold a high rank in the United States Army prior to the Civil War, and he believed that he was owed a higher rank in the Confederacy based off of that. That he was should have been higher than fourth ranking general officer in the Confederacy, and that would really spring up and really gets to the root of Johnston's, I guess you could really call it animosity toward Jefferson Davis, that really begins to grow in the months after First Manassas. I don't know, I'm not aware of Johnston really raising a stink about it right in the moment, but once things sort of settle down after July 1861, and Johnston kind of gets the cold shoulder from the press in regards to his role that he performed at First Manassas, then it really started to become an issue for Joe Johnston and really became, again, almost the point of friction, the main point of friction. There's a lot of point of frictions between Jefferson Davis and Joseph Johnston, but I think that's really what gets it started, and that relationship is never really quite repaired
Yeah.
after that.
Yeah, I could probably go out on a limb and make the argument that their inability to set aside their personal animosity is an important cause of the Confederacy's defeat. I wouldn't say it's the main cause, but like I think you could argue that they can't put aside their differences for the common good for the Confederacy's sake, and that cripples the Confederacy in a couple different instances.
Oh yeah, very, very much so. And Johnston kind of he's in one place and then he fades away for a little while during the war, and then he pops back up into another place. And every time he pops back up, despite Davis continually going back to him, that friction still remained between the two men. And like you said, it was really something they were never quite able to overcome. And in a lot of ways, I think part of the reason that Davis kept turning to Johnston was simply because he didn't have anybody else to go to
Yeah.
at the point, because Beauregard would alienate himself from the Davis administration as well
Yep.
in the fall of 1861. You have, I mean, by the end of the war, John Bell Hood is a shell of his former self, and of course perform does not accomplish the goals that the Davis administration wanted him to. So by the end of the war, the Confederacy is really starting to run out of people, and Johnson is just kind of the retread that they can constantly go back to.
Yeah.
And to Johnston's credit too, this is something that I think we often overlook, but the soldiers that served under him, many of them loved him.
Sure. Sure.
And so he did have the backing of the soldiers that fought for him and fought underneath him. I know you've been to the Bentonville battlefield. I've been too, and standing right behind those trenches of what's left of the Army of Tennessee, and wondering,
Yeah.
this late into the war, what's going through these guys' minds that they're willing to charge out of here and continue fighting. And I think maybe, I don't know this for sure. I'm not, as versed in the Army of Tennessee in 1865 certainly as others are, but you have to wonder, maybe Joe Johnston being there plays at least a small part in that.
Yeah, I would agree. I think it plays a really big part in that, and and they're just trying to buy time so that Johnston and Lee can link up at that point in the war. And of course, that doesn't work out. But it's interesting for you mentioned that Davis goes back to Johnston over and over, and I think part of that is because he's a full general. You've got to find something to do with a guy with that rank, and I mean, there's sort of like let's make up some positions for him. I think there's some of that, but when those early weeks of 1865 when things are pretty much going to hell in a handbasket, like Lee says Joe Johnston's the only person who can do this job in the Carolinas, and it was a full-throated defense of Johnston's ability as a commander and his ability to wage sort of a defensive war, which is what they need to be waging. So I mean, it's funny that Davis keeps going back because he doesn't have anybody, and part of that's the rank issue, but part of that's because maybe Johnson is the most suitable person for some of those gigs at the time too.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really not even not only the soldiers, the common foot soldiers that are fans of Johnston as well. But even in the aftermath of the Maryland campaign, which of course I've studied more than Manassas. I mean, Johnston and Beauregard don't really factor into that at all. But James Longstreet, none other than James Longstreet, writes to Johnston in October of 1862 asking for him to come back to
Yeah.
the Army of Northern Virginia. So he clearly has the backing of some high-ranking officers as well in the main Confederate field army in Virginia.
Yeah, a lot of people don't realize even in the immediate aftermath of Chancellorsville, Longstreet's asking if he can go out to Tennessee to link up with Johnston out there, and kind of drive to try to distract Grant. So yeah, Johnson is someone who cultivates a lot of loyalty among his acolytes. So
Yeah, and I can't remember, I was going back through my notes, but I can't remember if it's Craig Simons in his biography of Johnston or T. Harry Williams in his biography of Beauregard. But he referred to, I thought this really summed up Johnston best, that if Johnston was your superior officer, working for him was great. He would often give you a lot of latitude as a commander, but if Johnston was your subordinate, then he was going to make your life pretty much hell. Uh, so Johnston was a good superior officer, but maybe not a good subordinate
yeah.
officer.
And for folks who don't know quite all the nitty-gritty details, Samuel Cooper was first in that list. Albert Sidney Johnston was second on that list of full generals, and he gets that I think the most difficult job of the Confederacy, where he's
Mhm.
sent to the West and like defend this giant border with two guys. Like that basically is his order.
Yep.
And then Robert E. Lee is third, and then Joe Johnston is fourth, and then Beauregard is fifth. But in the regular army, Joe Johnston had been quartermaster general, and so he'd been a brigadier general, but he wasn't a field officer. He was a logistics guy. And so Lee ends up outranking him, even though he was only a colonel, because he was the highest ranking guy from Virginia with a field commission, and so based on how things shake out in Richmond, Lee gets that position right before Johnson, and Johnson is incensed. And the two of them had kind of have a rivalry, a friendly professional rivalry all through their careers. But that really irks Johnston and sticks in his craw in a way that he just never lets go.
Yeah, it really is a matter of honor for him, and he dug in his heels on that one, that's for sure.
Yeah, yeah. So when things start to unfold in Northern Virginia and Beauregard has command of the major army that is going to contest what appears to be a federal movement toward Manassas Junction, he wants Johnston's help, but he's outranked by Johnson. How do those dynamics then start to play into the Confederate situation as things develop in July?
Yeah, I think the first thing to understand is those armies, both Beauregard's army and Johnston's army, were always linked in Northern Virginia and in the Shenandoah Valley. That was sort of the essence of the Confederate strategy in Virginia in 1861, that the two armies would be within close enough distance that either army would have time. If Johnston should be attacked, that Beauregard could go out to Johnston's aid, or vice versa. If Beauregard was attacked, then Johnston's army could march to Beauregard's aid. And that was never the question of rank or superiority was never worked out beforehand. In fact, it wasn't worked out until Johnston arrived in Manassas Junction shortly after noon on the afternoon of July 20th, the day before the battle. And waiting for him there was a letter from Davis saying, "You outrank Beauregard." And so technically, Johnston is the field commander, the ranking field commander at least, during the fighting on July 21st. But he and Beauregard had kept up correspondence quite a bit, constantly and throughout June and early July. Beauregard and Johnson are kind of throwing their hands up in the air, saying, "Ah, the Federals are about to attack me. I need support. I need help." And nothing comes of that, of course. Johnston will do some fighting. And Beauregard too. There are some minor fights at places like Vienna, Fairfax Courthouse that relate to Beauregard's army. There's the fight at Falling Waters on July 2nd, 1861, between really Jackson's brigade, Thomas Jackson's brigade, not Stonewall Jackson just yet, and portions of Patterson's army. But there's no full-fledged offensive by either Federal army that really required the two to work together. Though Beauregard, who was always somebody that wanted to take the offensive and would try, but would often fail, especially in the summer of 1861, wanted to link up with Johnston and go on the offensive against McDowell. And on July 13th, Beauregard proposed this plan where Johnston would leave 5,000 of his men in the valley. Johnston's men would march to Beauregard's aid at Manassas Junction. Beauregard believed that McDowell's army was going to be divided into two separate wings. Why he believed that or how McDowell's army hadn't even left Washington, D.C. at this point. But regardless of that, Beauregard believed that the Confederates would be able to drive a wedge between the two wings of McDowell's army, defeat it in detail, and then everybody, the Confederates, would pack up and leave Manassas Junction, march back out to the valley, and defeat Patterson there. Which of course was quite a grand plan that obviously never materialized because just a few days later, McDowell's army started marching out toward Beauregard's defenses in Fairfax County and behind Bull Run. That ultimately led to Johnson, of course, having to bring his army to Manassas Junction. And when Johnson received word on July 17th that Beauregard, who had wired the Confederate War Department back in Richmond, that his outposts were under attack, that this now seemed to be the time of the federal attack that they had all been waiting for. The War Department will wire to Johnson and basically say, use your discretion. Can you go and support Beauregard? And Johnston, without hesitation, decided to go.
Hmm.
And so again, at this point, rank was not anything that either man really had a question about, I think. And again, Johnston and Beauregard, they had known each other during the Mexican-American War. There's actually, I got to make sure I get all my quotes right. But during the assault on Chapultepec in September of 1847, Johnston was leading four companies that led the main assault against the Mexican defenses there, and Beauregard joined in the assault just as a volunteer. He was somebody that didn't want to miss the big show and wanted to be involved right in the middle of it. And as Johnson's men were pinned down by Mexican fire, Beauregard yelled to Johnson, Colonel, what will you bet on this shot? And Johnston replied, drinks in the city of Mexico. And so Beauregard squeezed off a shot. Who knows if he actually hit anything, but according to Beauregard, he did. And he said, you have lost. You will have to pay for it. So the relationship between these men went back a while. And it really continued on despite the souring of relationship between Beauregard and Davis and Johnston and Davis, the two men, their relationship really did not deteriorate until after the war, which is
Yeah.
a story I know that we'll get to
Sure,
because
sure.
it relates to First Manassas. But I don't think Johnston had any qualms about going to support Beauregard and finding that he might be outranked. And in fact, even Johnston, when he arrived, like I said, on July 20th, he and Beauregard immediately sorted out the situation. And Johnston said, yes, I'm the ranking officer. But again, Johnson's a good superior officer for somebody. You want to be his subordinate. And he gave Beauregard a lot of leeway and essentially said to Beauregard, you've been here longer than I have. You know the terrain. You know the road networks. You know the positions of your troops. You know the positions of the enemy. I'll leave it up to you to essentially orchestrate the battle. And so Beauregard worked throughout the night of July 20th to plan really his first battle plan for July 21st. He ends up planning three different things, neither of which really come off to work. But Johnston will sign off on it on the morning of 4:30 on the morning of July 21st, even though he had some, as Johnston. Drowsy waking up from a slumber underneath a tree near Manassas Junction, woke up and read the order and was confused by it, not because he was drowsy, because it was very poorly written.
Right. It's like
Johnston still signed off on it and approved it.
it's an infamously poorly written order.
Oh yes, yeah. It talks about brigades supporting different brigades that weren't actually there. It messes up some of the unit designations. It just yeah, and it really never gets off
Yeah.
all that well. But Beauregard is constantly going to have that in the back of his mind on July 21st, especially the morning of July 21st, of trying to take the offensive against the federal troops out in front of him. Basically, in a nutshell, all of his plans if in involved crossing Bull Run near the Confederate center, the area of Mitchell's Ford, Blackburn's Ford, swinging up to Centerville and capturing Centerville and basically cutting McDowell's army off from Washington, D.C. But for a variety of reasons, like I said, none of those plans really ended up happening. Portions of them did, but the portions that were supposed to support those portions did not. Some Confederate troops crossed over Bull Run. Some of the orders were never delivered. It is a case in point of what can go wrong when you have green soldiers and green staff officers and generals who, yes, they may be generals and have military experience, but have never commanded thousands of men on a battlefield before of just what can go wrong.
Yeah.
And for the Confederates, with their offensive plans on July 21st, pretty much everything that morning went wrong for them, and they
Mhm.
were never able to launch a true offensive.
Yeah. And I think it speaks well to both Confederate commanders that when Beauregard's plans go off the rails, and maybe that's a generous description because they don't even really get started to go off the rails. Um, but like when things start to go awry, they both seem to adapt under fire on the fly fairly well, I think.
Yes, I agree. I think how this conversation had started, you and I were talking a few weeks ago, and you had asked me, or somebody had asked me, how did I rate Burnside or Burnside? Geez, sorry, still in 1862 mode. Beauregard and Johnston. I knew I was going to do that. Beauregard and Johnston, as how was their performance? And I kind of just started talking about it and thinking out
Yeah.
loud, and really came to think that yes, both of them did adapt pretty well. Now Johnston was quicker to adapt, and both of them were around Manassas Junction the morning of July 21st, and then they rode out to a place known as Lookout Hill, which is just south of Mitchell's Ford, which was really the Confederate center. Beauregard's line was 7 miles long along Bull Run. And so Johnston and Beauregard were posted behind the Confederate center, waiting for the sounds of battle to erupt out in front of them that would indicate that Beauregard's offensive and his attack has begun. And as they're there at Lookout Hill, they are waiting for those sounds of battle. They are not increasing out in front of them. Instead, the sounds of battle off to their left and off to their north, beyond the Confederate left, are continuing to grow with fighting at the Stone Bridge, and then eventually Matthews Hill. And word is going to be passed famously by signal from E.P. Alexander that McDowell's column has looped around the Confederate left, and that's what will bring on the main portion of fighting starting at Matthews Hill that morning of July 21st. Um, and Johnson is constantly, I think, kind of telling Beauregard, our attack's not working. The Federals have taken the initiative, and we need to start sending troops up in that direction. And they will in small pieces. Bernard B's brigade will head in that direction that morning. Jackson's brigade will begin moving in that direction as well. But it's really not until about 11 a.m. when the sounds of battle just are increasing from the north and continue to increase from the north that you nobody could really ignore them, and also that Beauregard and Johnston received reports that Federal troops across Bull Run were felling trees, indicating that they were not planning on attacking the Confederate positions around Mitchell's Ford and Blackburn's Ford, and further downstream as well. And so Johnston pointed off to the north and said, "The battle is there. I am going," and hopped on his horse and rode up to Henry Hill, and Beauregard very shortly thereafter followed him. So Beauregard was a little bit slower to recognize that the battle had really gone out of his control and out of his hands. And finally, Johnston, who was growing impatient, decided the battle's there. That's where I'm going. I'm going to go see what help I can be up there. And I think Johnston doing that really awakens Beauregard to the reality of the situation. And so the two of them will ride together up to Henry Hill and arrive at Henry Hill at about 12:30, right after or right when things had really been going poorly for the Confederate troops at that point. B's brigade, Evans' brigade, portions of Bartow's brigade as well had all been shot up atop Matthews Hill, and they had been driven off of Matthews Hill south of the Warrenton Turnpike to those positions on top of Henry Hill. And Johnston and Beauregard will almost immediately get to work there rallying soldiers and trying to save the day for the Confederate Army at that point.
And it seemed to me that Beauregard's really kind of slow because he's really still looking for the battle he wants rather than the battle he gets. Whereas Johnson seemed to recognize that he's got a battle and that's the battle he's got to fight. When they both get on the front, though, how do they each meet that moment?
Yeah, they are right up on the front lines themselves. Johnston will spend time talking to Bernard B, who is B is sort of shattered by what has happened to his brigade. He's almost kind of breaking down. Um, there's the more famous incident of B riding up to Jackson and Jackson describing that we will give them the bayonet, et cetera, et cetera. And B sort of has a similar interaction with Johnston, probably before that. And Johnston tells him, go to the rear, rally your troops. Johnston himself tries to take the colors of the Fourth Alabama and tries to rally them. And the color bearer of the Fourth Alabama says, "No, just tell me where to go, and I'll go." And Johnston then reluctantly takes his hand off of the staff of the Fourth Alabama's colors. But Beauregard is doing very much the same thing. They are rallying individual units. They were both right on the front lines themselves, speaking with individual soldiers, speaking with individual commanders, and it really does, I think, is an underrated aspect of why the Confederates do win is because of the personal hands-on leadership of Beauregard and Johnston at that point. Jackson's brigade arriving on the battlefield is obviously plays a big role, and it gives those Confederate units that had been so shot up in the morning's fight, it gives them something to congeal around. And so without Jackson's brigade, you wouldn't have that. But I think without Johnson and Beauregard's leadership being there to inspire these troops, and there's no doubt about it, both of those men were very inspiring
Mm.
on
Yeah.
the battlefield and as leaders. And that showed, and a lot of those Confederate units did rally, and it maybe not in full regimental formations, but they did take part, many of them, in the fighting at Henry Hill as well, in helping to drive the Federal troops back. But it's at that point too when both Johnson and Beauregard really realized, well, you can't have two heads of an army right here on the front lines themselves, and Beauregard at this point will suggest to Johnston that Johnston should head to the rear to the Lewis home that's called Portici, about a mile behind Henry Hill, and that Johnston would be responsible then as the ranking field officer for the strategy, the big strategy of the Confederates that day of funneling troops up to the front lines of where they're needed. And in the meantime, Beauregard would remain behind on Henry Hill, or really more in the front, on Henry Hill, and really tactically help place those units on the field to the points where opportunity will be found, and really help to turn the tide there. So Johnson was reluctant to do this. He did express some hesitation about this, but ultimately Beauregard was able to kind of talk him into it and say, "This is where you belong. You're." Maybe it was Beauregard appealing to Johnson's love of rank, but he said, "You're the ranking officer here. Your role is more behind the lines, and I'm supposed to be the one up here." And that's ultimately the arrangement that worked out between the two generals. And so Beauregard remained closer to the lines. Johnston remained back at his field headquarters at Portici, shuttling troops up the road toward Henry Hill. But then, really, by 3:30 as well, once more of Johnston's army began arriving, including Arnold Elzey's brigade, which was under the command of Edmund Kirby Smith. Talk about a story of rank. Smith left his brigade behind at Piedmont Station. He didn't want to miss the show, so he just attached himself to Elzey's brigade and said, "Well, I outrank you, so I'm taking charge of your brigade." But when Smith arrived at Portici, he essentially said, "Where do you want me to go?" And Elzey asked the same thing, and Johnston sort of threw up his hands and just said, "Well, I don't really know the road networks well. I don't know exactly what's going on." But Johnston himself decided to personally go back into the fight and started leading Smith's brigade into the fight. And it was sort of Johnston that really developed the idea of extending the Confederate left south from Henry Hill and then across the Warrenton Turnpike onto Chin Ridge.
Uh,
And it was the fighting there that would ultimately drive or force McDowell's army off the field. And so Johnston did come back onto the field and play a more personal, hands-on role in that. And like I said, that was the attack that would force the Federals off the field. But Beauregard in the aftermath would get more of the press and the
uh,
heroics of all this, I think, because he was on the field more than Johnston was.
it's kind of interesting the way you described that, Johnston is the ranking officer will be behind sort of directing the battle plan, and Beauregard being the subordinate will be kind of on the field leading sort of the tactical level. And that's exactly the opposite of what Beauregard comes up with Albert Sidney Johnston at Shiloh, where as the Army commander, Albert Sidney's on the front lines and Beauregard, as second in command, is kind of in the back, funneling troops forward. And I suppose Shiloh is a really a good lesson in why your Army commander shouldn't be on the front line. You know?
Yeah, very very much so. And I've always wondered about that, what Beauregard was thinking at that point. If he wanted to play more of the role that Joe Johnston had played at First Manassas, if he was more comfortable in that role or what. Because of course the Confederate Army at Shiloh was still a Green Army as well in many ways too. Um, but yeah, I've always wondered what was going through Beauregard's mind when he made that decision of basically I'm going to hang up back here and Albert Sidney Johnson can go right around the lines and of course end up getting shot because of it. But
Yeah.
yeah, we'll never quite know for sure, unfortunately.
So at First Manassas, Johnson shows up. Federals are driven off the field. Confederates win the day. How do these two then navigate those hours and days in the wake of the battle? Jefferson Davis shows up, and I mean, so there's a lot going on. And yet, because these are green armies and green troops, like nobody's even sure kind of what like victory even looks like at this point. Like, what does a one battle look like, and what do we do with it? How do these two generals kind of navigate their way through this mystery terrain?
They try. They do something, which I think is a something that's misunderstood about First Manassas, that there was no Confederate pursuit. That's not true. Confederate troops did cross Bull Run at multiple points and pursue. Well, firstly, they pursued Federal troops to Bull Run. Jeb Stuart's cavalry was up by Sudley Church by the evening of July 21st, and what Johnston, who again is still the ranking officer, the ranking general on the field, told Beauregard is basically go straight at the Federals anywhere that you can find them in your pursuit. And then it became Johnston's role to try to organize a pursuit that would converge on Centerville. So Beauregard's going to go straight after him, and Johnston's going to try to cut the Federals off, essentially. And there are some pieces of the pursuit that will work. There's a battalion of Confederate cavalry under an officer named Radford that will pursue along the Warrenton Turnpike, and they scoop up a lot of Federal prisoners. Some of South Carolinians under Millage Bonham's brigade, really under Joseph Kershaw, will pursue along the Warrenton Turnpike as well. They'll be accompanied by a couple of field artillery pieces that will wreak havoc on the Federal withdrawal and really turn it into a rout at the bridge over Cub Run. So the Confederates do pursue, but there's not enough of a large scale effort to really hamper the Federals from getting back to Centerville and then ultimately beyond Centerville. And this is one of the problems that is found throughout the Civil War, the problem of pursuit, of course. But one of the things that I think really works in McDowell's favor is that McDowell had troops that were held on the north side of Bull Run that were in reserve. And those troops did come up to Centerville. And so they were still green troops, of course, but they were fresh troops
Yeah.
that could hold off these Confederates that had, marched a great deal on July 21st and fought hard in sweltering heat. And some of these men had crossed Bull Run multiple times in the case of the Confederate right. So they were tired. There was a lot of confusion that really sprung from earlier that day with Beauregard's plan that never really quite got off the ground. And I think Joe Johnston said it best in one of his post-war writings that that the Confederate Army was just as disorganized by victory as the Federals were disorganized by defeat. And when Jefferson Davis arrived on the field, really he gets there right after the Federals start falling back and are driven off the field. He has pursuit in his mind. There's a story that he'll go down to the Holcomb's Branch Hospital just north of Portici, between Henry Hill and Johnston's headquarters, and he'll find Jackson, and Jackson will supposedly say to him as he's getting his hand bandaged up, will say to him, "Give me 10,000 men, and I'll take Washington, D.C." And so I think Davis sort of gets that mindset, and then he will ride back to Liberia, which is a house that still stands in the city of Manassas, Beauregard's headquarters, and we'll meet with Johnston first, beginning at about 11 p.m. on the evening of July 21st. Beauregard will come later, and maybe as a sign of the times, Beauregard would send a note to Davis saying, I'm not going to come meet with you. He doesn't say it quite like that, but I'm not going to come meet with you until I take care of my wounded on the field. And so Beauregard will arrive later. And it's at that point when the idea of a really full-scale pursuit starts to percolate in the minds of the Confederate High Command. And both Beauregard and Johnston just simply tell Davis that they don't think it can be done. And the room sort of falls silent. And then somebody suggests, well, Mr. President, since you're here, why don't you write the orders? And if you write the orders, then we'll try to follow them. And so Davis will, but really there is no major Confederate pursuit beyond the few that do take place on July 21st. After that, the Confederates continue to basically just consolidate their gains behind Bull Run, and I think really, we think about Bull Run and or Manassas, whatever you'd like to call it, and later uh, when viewing it throughout the rest of the Civil War. But at that time in July 1861, there were about 5,000 casualties, about 3,000 Federal casualties, about 2,000 Confederate casualties. That was the bloodiest single day in American
Uh-huh.
military history at that point. Um, by the end of the war, it would be the 35th bloodiest day in American military history. Estimate, Civil War arithmetic is never perfect, but so I think both armies are just truly shocked by what they see. And I think a lot of the soldiers, the individual soldiers are as well. And I think that just leads up the ranks, so to speak, to the point where Johnston and Beauregard just realize that their army is in no condition
Uh-huh.
to pursue McDowell. And maybe perhaps they could have pursued McDowell, but to have fought McDowell's army again, I just don't think they were in any condition to do that. They recognized that, and ultimately, the First Manassas campaign will basically end at the banks of Bull Run on July 21st that evening.
Uh-huh. And and it seems to me that Joe Johnson was very sober in his view of things right from the beginning. But this is an especially sobering moment for Beauregard, who'd been kind of thinking big, grandiose plans, and my army can do this, that, and the other thing. And suddenly it's like, oh, and sort of the weight of it. I've always assumed that Johnson maybe was better prepared for that moment psychologically and internally than Beauregard was.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's probably true. And I think some of it may have been too, Johnson was behind the lines and he was feeding these Confederate forces up toward the front lines. And I think he saw in his position there the state of the Confederate forces that were arriving on the field and how tired and exhausted
Yeah.
they were from riding a train all morning on July 21st to then marching at the double quick up from Manassas Junction to get up to the battlefield itself. And so I think Johnson has the bigger picture in his mind of the state of the army, whereas Beauregard has a much smaller view of that, sort of got blinders on, if you will, like a horse, because he's right on the front lines, and all he could see was victory. He
Yeah.
could just see the Federals being driven off the field, whereas Johnston, I think, yes, like you said, is taking in the bigger picture and just recognizing that the army that he sees as a whole is not capable of doing anything more than what it already had done
You
on
made
July 21st.
and you mentioned something that I think is really important and worth kind of backing up for just a second, because you said that Johnson understood the effects of riding a train on these guys. And we hadn't really talked about that at all in
Hmm.
this discussion, but first time that the railroad is used to move men to combat is Johnson's army getting on the train at Piedmont Station and coming over from the valley. And I think we forget or underestimate the physical toll and exhaustion that railroad travel at that moment in that instance took on those men.
Yeah, it was an incredibly frustrating experience. Johnston was frustrated at how long it took him on the train. The Manassas Gap Railroad that connected the two armies was a single track railroad. So you can only, there's, not like you can cross trains back and forth, going back and forth. So those trains had to go from Piedmont Station, which is modern day Delaplane, just east of the Blue Ridge Mountains, ride into Manassas Junction, drop those troops off, and then turn around and drive back out to Piedmont Station. And it was, like you said, I mean, railroads were, pretty new technology back then. They had not really been used, at least in American history, as a means of moving a large body of troops, and it was an incredibly frustrating experience. One of the engineers was actually basically drumhead court-martialed by Confederate soldiers who believed that he was sabotaging the effort because he was moving so slow. And they believed he was a Unionist, and that's why he was moving so slow.
Uh,
I tend to wonder if it was the nature of the operation,
yeah.
that it was a very slow operation, and Johnston knew it, and he knew that well. I think another thing that may have played into Johnston's mind is he was of the two, Johnston and Beauregard. Johnston had faced both armies. He had faced McDowell's army, and he had to face Patterson's army.
Right.
And in fact, when Johnston arrived in Manassas Junction on the 20th, after getting off the train, part of the reason he agreed with Beauregard's plan of attack was because Johnston believed that it wouldn't be long before Patterson realized that Johnston was gone, and Patterson would move to link up with McDowell.
Mm.
And so Johnston wanted to move quick, but I wonder if maybe in Johnston's mind, once the battle came to an end, he had that second army in the back of his mind of thinking we might have to do this again. You know,
Oh, yeah.
we've just beat McDowell, but we might have to worry about this again.
Yeah.
And so maybe we don't want to bite off more than we can chew, so to speak, because there might be another Federal army lurching, somewhere nearby.
Yeah. So Confederates win the battle. Someone gets to take credit. How do Johnson and Beauregard navigate that aspect of the campaign?
Yeah, so it's as I mentioned, Johnston was clearly pleased with Beauregard's efforts because before Davis departed the Manassas area on July 22nd, Johnston personally appealed to Davis that Beauregard should be promoted to full general on Johnston's recommendation. And so that will happen. And then once things quiet down, I think everybody's kind of in the heat of the moment. You're working with each other. Once things started to quiet down, the press doesn't have much else to talk about besides the Confederate victory at Manassas. Then Johnston starts to get pushed toward the back again.
Uh,
Beauregard was the hero of the press. He's the hero of Fort Sumter. He's now the hero of Manassas. Beauregard was seen out on the front lines. He was the one that received a lot of the credit for the Confederate victory at First Manassas. And I think Johnston, maybe he didn't feel slighted. I don't think he blamed Beauregard for that.
mhm,
But I think Johnson certainly felt slighted by that. And that really carried through the rest of the war and their friendship, and ultimately led to their friendship deteriorating
mhm,
after the war as well. Davis too, who of course, it's in the aftermath of First Manassas that Johnston's relationship with Davis will start to fall apart over the rank issue, and Beauregard's relationship with Davis would also start to fall apart for a variety of issues at that point. But Davis also received a lot of credit. A lot of Confederate newspapers talked about Davis arrived on the field, and he was the one that really spurred the Confederate victory, that he arrived just in time to feed these troops up to the front lines and drive the Federals off the field. And so Johnston was not only taking he was really back in the third row.
yeah,
He's behind Davis and Beauregard in terms of the credit that those three men received for their actions on July 21st. And of
yeah.
course, I really do think Johnson does deserve a lot of credit. He was not wrong in arguing that, but probably the way he did it after the war is what really put the hatchet in the relationship between Beauregard and Johnston, and they really just even worsened things if things could get any worse between Davis and Johnston.
Yeah. Um, in your opinion, does Beauregard get transferred out west because there are too many cooks in the Manassas area kitchen, or because Albert Sidney Johnston really does need some help, as quickly becomes apparent in 1862, in those early campaigns? Why do you think Beauregard gets the shift?
I think there is the issue of command did become a problem out east. In fact, Davis did suggest to Johnston actually of going to take command out in Western Virginia, and Johnston, said no. That he didn't want to take the back seat again, I think, in terms of his command. That now he was the ranking officer in the largest Confederate field army at the time, right outside of Washington, D.C. This is where he wanted to be.
Yeah.
And so I do think there was that problem did arise. And even though Beauregard and Johnston worked well together throughout the fall of 1861, Beauregard essentially led half of Johnston's army. Um, Beauregard was granted a lot of administrative leeway in that, so he sort of had an independent command, but of course his boss was right over his shoulder.
Uh,
Um, I do think that there was, yeah, like you said, maybe too many cooks in the kitchen,
yeah,
and ultimately somebody had to go.
sure.
And with Beauregard's worsening relationship with Davis at that point, I think that he's ultimately the one that will get carried. Well, and ultimately, of course, he does get carried
Yeah.
out west to work with the other Johnston. And not to say that the other Johnston is the lesser Johnston, but just the other Johnston in the Confederate High Command.
Sure, sure. And at least with Beauregard's transfer, there's no face saving that has to happen there. It's like we're sending the hero to the West. Like you can play that up and it plays well. If you
Mhm.
transfer Joe Johnston out there, then you have too many Johnstons in the kitchen out there. But also
I
there's
was just
sort
going
of
to say
like, yeah, no,
that.
it's like um, so Johnson and Beauregard serve well during this phase, but you've alluded a couple times their friendship does not survive the post-war years. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, Johnston and Beauregard will work with each other again multiple times during the course of the war, especially late in the war in 1865. Well, early in 1865, but late in the war. They'll work together again in the Carolinas, and the friendship seems to be perfectly fine. In fact, again, one of Beauregard's biographers, T. Harry Williams, referred to it as one of the firmest friendships of the Civil War
Hmm?
between the two men. And it's even after the war when there's things up in the air about the status of former Confederate officers, Beauregard will write to both Robert E. Lee and Johnston asking for advice about what he should do, and both Lee and Johnston will tell him, apply for amnesty, etc. But I think with Johnston, there were a lot of not only physical wounds that he had to recover from during the war, but those personality wounds, if you will. And by 1873, and Johnston's memoirs, his narrative of military operations, would be published in 1874. He writes that in a very self-serving way that really downplayed the role that Beauregard and Davis played on July 21st, 1861, uh, at the expense of, boosting the role that he played, or that he perceived that he played. And in fact, when Beauregard read it, he wrote that he wasn't even sure if he was at First Manassas based off Johnston's account.
Wow.
So this really starts the fracture of the relationship between the two men. Beauregard is going to start a war of words. He would eventually publish some of his own memoirs and write essays that would appear in the Century magazine, including most notably in 1884. But once Johnston's memoirs came out in 1874, Beauregard immediately went to work writing the men who had been on his staff in July 1861, saying, "Can you just I want to write something back, help me prepare some notes." And Beauregard really ended up not writing anything himself at that time because he was busy with other work, he had said, but his staff officers, he let the leashes off of his staff officers, and they were like dogs going to town now, and started attacking Johnston in the newspapers. Davis as well was getting in on this because Johnston was downplaying the role that he had played
Yeah.
in all of this as well, and so it just leads to this friendship really coming to an end and never ultimately recovering after the war.
Yeah. So, as a final assessment of Johnston and Beauregard at First Manassas, if you had to give them a grade, this is totally an artificial measure, but if you had to give them a grade, how would you grade their partnership?
Um, I think it'd have to be somewhere in the, I wouldn't say an A plus, but probably maybe an A minus,
Okay.
or even a B plus. I mean, which isn't bad. They were able to adjust on the fly pretty quickly,
Mhm.
and despite Beauregard's uh hardiness in doing that, once Johnston really says the battle's there, I'm going, and Beauregard rode with him, then both of them really take the bull by the horns and start orchestrating the moves that are necessary to create Confederate battlefield victory.
Mhm.
And there was initially some, I hesitate to use the word tension, but again, there was some hesitance on Johnston's part when Beauregard suggested, "Hey, you go to the back."
Yeah.
And Johnston didn't want to at first, but ultimately did. And I think the two of them, it really worked out pretty well. And that was part of certainly the ingredients for Confederate success.
Yeah.
On July 21st was the team of Beauregard and Johnston, and two men that we think were so worried about their reputations, and they were, but they were able to really set those aside and work together in the middle of this friendship that had been going on for more than a decade,
Yeah.
and work together and achieve one of the most signal victories for the Confederacy during the entire war.
Jeez. That's a great summation. I'll agree with your A minus, by the way, but I
All
think
right,
that
good, good.
yeah, yeah. I think you summed it up perfectly there. Kevin, thanks for spending some time chatting with us today about these two fellas.
Absolutely. Thank you. It was fun to really dive into this a bit more. So I appreciate you coming up with the idea.
Always a pleasure to chat with you, pal. So I'm Chris Mackowski on behalf of Kevin Pawlak for the Emerging Civil War podcast. Thanks for being with us. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.